Hello, my name is Dr. Matt Zakreski, and if you're watching this recording, you are here to learn about failure. This talk is called Failure is Fundamental, a Psychologist's Approach to Failure. I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski. Everybody calls me Dr. Matt. I'm a clinical psychologist and international speaker, and I'm a grown-up gifted kid. I was identified as gifted in the 90s. And when I became a psychologist, I thought, I want to work with people like me. And that's what I'm doing here today. And we're here to talk about failure, which is really great because I am almost certainly going to make some mistakes during this talk. And if you look closely, you're going to find at least one typo. And even though it sort of drives me a little bonkers to leave it there, I make sure I leave it there, A, to give you something to look for, and B, to show that failure is not the end of the world. So we're going to start with an example of a famous failure. So here's Jennifer Lawrence. She's just won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She goes to walk up on stage in front of, thousands of her peers and an international audience of millions of people. And what does she do? She falls on her face. Um, and it's almost painful to watch, right? And it's one of those things like you can imagine, like you've reached the pinnacle of your career, right? And all of a sudden, you fall down. You fail at a thing you have done hundreds of thousands of times, just walking up a flight of stairs. And in this case, she wasn't able to be successful at it. Now, I show you this clip to sort of model a big failure and get you emotionally engaged. We're going to come back to Jennifer a little later. So, what is failure? Failure is a lack of success. You tried to do something and it did not work. You were not successful at it. The other thing is that failure is an inability to meet an expectation. And this is really relevant for our conversations because sometimes the expectations we are being held to are unfair, ill-informed, and sometimes even aggressively incorrect. So we're going to talk about how to adjust expectations to move in the other direction. There are stages of failure. The first is a failure of vision. I don't even know where I want to go or what I want to be. This is existential depression. I know my life needs to change, but I wouldn't even know what that could look like. This is where a lot of people end up in my therapy office. Second is a failure of tactics. I know what I want, but I don't know how to get there. So a lot of people come to me and they say, I want to lose weight, but I don't know what to do. Like, should I run? Should I do push-ups? Should I eat better? We need to have a tactics that work. Next, we have failure of strategy. I have a plan, I followed the plan, but I haven't yet achieved my goal. I see this a lot when I have gifted kids who have to finally learn how to study, whether that's in high school or college. And they're like, okay, I'm trying to learn this whole studying thing, but it's not really working out for me. The grades haven't turned around yet. And last but not least, failure of adherence. I had a plan and I followed it and it worked. Hooray! But I couldn't sustain the success. And for you parents out there, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, every so often we're like, okay, this is how we're going to organize the toys. This is the way we're going to do it. And we have a plan and we implement the plan and the toys go away and we feel really good about ourselves. And then you look up 3 weeks later and the playroom is a mess again. So adhering to a strategy is also very challenging. Why do neurodivergent people feel this more? So there's this fusion of giftedness and the sense of self. If I'm not the smart kid, if I'm not the giant air quotes genius, then who even am I? Right? We wrap up a lot of our identity into this idea of that we are gifted. And if too much of our identity fuses to that, failure doesn't just feel like a thing I did poorly, it feels like a referendum on yourself. Second is gifted people or neurodivergent people tend to be isolated. They tend to struggle to find community. So if you fail, that feeling is felt more by being isolated, by being alone. So we need to find community to help support us through failure. Next is experience. If you've never failed or rarely failed before, then you don't necessarily have the developed resiliency skills. So, if you've always gotten straight A's on tests and all of a sudden you get to high school chemistry and you get a 72 on your first test, that's going to feel worse because you don't have the experience of navigating those moments. And last but not least, emotional intensity. Giftedness is a lot of things, but if it's one thing, it is intensity. So the physical and neuropsychological differences in the gifted brain create intense emotional interplay. Frankly, you care. And one of the things I think it's important to start these conversations with is the idea that failure is inevitable. And if you know gifted people, or if you're gifted yourself, we will go to the ends of the earth to make sure failure doesn't happen. And since it's unavoidable, this cartoon, I think, is a pretty good example. You're a perfectionist. No, I'm not. I try to minimize errors down to zero, close to zero, because that's the thing. Like, we'll never get them to zero. We just want to make that number as small as we can. And it sort of tees me up for a good story. So I used to work at a bar in New Jersey where I grew up. And there was one night, I'd worked a double shift. It's the end of the day. I'm exhausted. We're loading cases of beer into the beer fridge. I loaded 7 cases of beer. When I went to put the 8th one in there, I dropped it and it shattered all over the place. Now, as a gifted person and as an intense human, plus someone who's pretty exhausted, I was having a little bit of a meltdown, right? And my colleague looked at me and said, "You know what? I think one of the things you got to think about here is that today your success rate was 1 out of 8. You put 8 cases of beer in there, you dropped 1. So your failure rate was 1 out of 8. Tomorrow, try and make it 1 out of 20, and then 1 out of 24, and then 1 out of 30, 1 out of 33, 1 out of 37, 1 out of 40, 1 out of 50, 1 out of 71." Right? You say you're never going to get that top number to 0, but you can make the bottom number as big as you possibly can. And that really helped me, because it's the sort of thing, like, you're never going to get that top number to 0. It doesn't work that way. But you have control over how big the bottom number is. So there's a big difference between 1 out of 8 and 1 out of 80 and 1 out of 8,000. Now, as a psychologist, of course, I tend to look at things through the therapy lens. And therapy is great because you cannot fail at therapy, nor can you win at therapy. It is a judgment-free zone. Therapy is a place to process your feelings and be validated, and it's also a place to practice failing and recovering. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in session and gone through, here's how I'm going to ask this person to the dance, or here's how I'm going to apply for this job, or here's how I'm going to finally ask this person out, or here's how I'm going to give this speech at a wedding. And it's like, let's refine those approaches so that you get a little better at it, because it's an opportunity to fail gracefully. And there are many approaches to therapy, but they're all based on 2 fundamental concepts. The first is we change our relationship to our thoughts. And the second is we want to decrease FID, or what we call in psychology the big 3: frequency, intensity, and duration. So how intense the feelings are, how often they show up, and how long they last. One of the approaches to therapy that I have found works really well for gifted people is the acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. This is Steve Hayes and his group at the University of Nevada. And the idea here is that we want to experience all human emotions, not just the fun ones, not just the pleasurable ones. And to do so, we aim to develop cognitive and psychological flexibility, which gives us emotional openness. You're basically being more accepting to the things that happen in our lives, whether we want them to or not. And it uses many techniques, not the least of which is mindfulness, but we're also going to practice radical acceptance. Now, ACT therapy is organized around this idea, what we call the hexaflex. The hexaflex are these 6 things that are going to flow into psychological flexibility. You'll notice the bold text up top are the things we want: present moment focused, living our values, taking committed action, seeing ourselves as context, diffusing ourselves from our thoughts, and accepting what happens to us, all about increasing psychological flexibility. The italicized text underneath are the things that we are probably doing, which bring us to therapy, right? Getting stuck in the past or stuck in the future, not living our values, being stuck, seeing ourselves as content, not context, fusing to our thoughts, and avoiding the things that happen to us. So we're going to talk about how to use each of the 6 steps of ACT to increase our flexibility and thus deal with failure. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about acceptance. So you see here we got a picture of a beach ball in a pool. And wherever you are watching this, I want you to imagine that I'm asking you to take this beach ball, go in the pool, and hold it under the water. Now, no matter how big you are or strong you are or tough you are, sooner or later that beach ball is coming buck up out of the water, right? That's what it wants to do. And what's going to happen is that you're going to fail at that task, not because you're not smart or clever or strong or talented or any of those things, because the task is not succeedable. And what ends up happening when the ball comes splashing out of the water, not only did we fail at our task, we get soaking wet. And this triggers a thing we like to call the struggle switch. So I'm upset that I failed, and I'm angry that I'm wet. Now I'm sad that I'm angry that I'm wet, and I'm frustrated that I failed. Now I'm worried about being sad that I'm angry that I'm upset. Now I'm angry that I'm worried that I'm sad, and that's where meltdowns come from. These feelings just cascade on top of each other in a way that becomes very unpleasant to deal with. So instead of fighting to keep the beach ball under the water, we let the beach ball come to the surface of the water. Now, if the beach ball represents our failure or our emotions, the things we're trying to hold back, hold under, push away, they're still there. They're floating around the surface of the water. And you might think, well, I don't want them there. Well, of course you don't. We'd rather the beach ball not be in the pool at all. But since we can't necessarily take the beach ball out of the pool, by letting it move slowly around the top of the water, it gives us abilities to deal with it in a different way. So the beach ball floats towards us. Well, we swim to the other end of the pool, or we push it away, or we, you know, even get out of the pool. It's not about getting rid of the feeling. It's about learning to live with it, accepting its presence. The idea is that you are much more flexible and capable if you're not spending all your energy trying to do something that's impossible, in this case, holding the beach ball under the water. You're never going to succeed at that. What you'll find is if you give yourself permission to move the beach ball or move yourself in relation to the beach ball, you get all this capability back. And now the feelings are still there, but they don't feel as scary because you're not working so hard to make them go away. So failure is unavoidable. We should stop trying to avoid it. When we embrace failure, it doesn't stop existing, but it bothers us less because we're working less hard to keep it from happening. Failure triggers more uncomfortable feelings. We talked about the struggle switch, and you gain your values and your committed action back when you're able to let things just be. Next piece we're going to talk about is present moment focus. So psychological stress pulls us away from the present. Something bothers us. If it's anxiety, we're whipped to the future, right? We are worried, okay, well, if I don't pass this test, then I'm not going to get a good grade in this class, which means I'm not going to have a good transcript for high school, which means I'm not going to go to a good college, which means I'm not going to get a good job, which means I'm not going to meet a good partner, which means I'm going to end up sleeping under the 3rd Street Bridge. And it's like you just pulled yourself 24 years into the future. And really all we're talking about is a bio exam, right? All we need to do is pull ourselves back to where we are right now. And then depression yanks us to the past. You start thinking about that file folder of every single failure you've ever had opens up. Oh, I missed the shot in basketball. That reminds me of these other shots I missed in basketball, and the time I missed the goal in soccer, and the time I struck out in baseball, and. Now, it isn't about fighting off those things. That's something our brain does naturally. But you remind ourselves the only thing I can do right now is affect the present. I can't change what's going to happen in the future, and I definitely can't change what's already happened. If I focus my energies on the present moment, I'm going to do better and thus be more likely to succeed and feel better. When we get yanked away, we are less present to receive the good things that are happening to us right now. We are less willing to accept that good things can or will happen, right? Because we're fighting wars in the future or reliving our lowlights from the past. And we're less able to recover, respond, and reach out. So one of the things you can do is that if you're worried about failure, if you are freaking out about the results of something, remind yourself that no matter what happens, good or bad, all I can do is affect what's happening right now. I trust myself and my community and my people who support me to help me move through the things that happen, good, bad, or otherwise. The idea here, and this is a great quote, I say this in therapy all the time, is don't stumble over something behind you. A lot of us have baggage and stuff in our past we don't like and we're not proud of and we're kind of wish didn't happen. I would raise my hand on that one, but it's behind us for better or for worse. So let's try and move forward. The next thing we're going to talk about is values, living our values. Now, this is where this factors into gifted education. So gifted education is a values-based system because regular education is all about following the rules. They love the rules, right? Regular school is about compliance. That doesn't work for gifted and 2E learners, right? We break rules, we push boundaries, we think outside the box. Gifted people and gifted education values individual interests and passions. So if you don't want to read Tom Sawyer and you want to read Chaucer, great. Let's talk about how we integrate Chaucer and what we're trying to learn from our ELA lesson right now. Gifted education is about moving through what we already know so we can get to what you don't know. That's not how regular education works, right? Regular education is very stepwise, right? One step after the other, move along a pace. Gifted education is cool. You know how to add? Cool. Let's move you on to multiplication, right? You've shown us you can do the thing. And it's all about meaningful challenge, not just work for the sake of work. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it's about meaningful challenge. Because if you come to me and you say, I want to jump really high, my first question is, how high can you jump? And my second question is, how high do you want to jump? One way to figure this out is to do a process that we like to call the leading edge of learning. So this chart up here is the Yerkes-Dodson law. The Yerkes-Dodson law shows that everybody has an ideal level of stress. So too little stress, we're underloaded and we disengage. We don't care, right? If you were a high-level soccer player and I asked you to try and dribble the ball in a straight line, that's so boring, you're not going to engage in it. But if you're a high-level soccer player and I say, okay, great, now go play Leo Messi one-on-one, that's probably too hard and you're going to disengage because it's too difficult. We're trying to find the optimum performance, right? What's the right level of stress? To do that, we need to know what's starting, right? So if things are too easy, disengage. If things are too hard, we can't engage. We have to make space for failure in this process to talk about how this level setting is a trial and error process. Because we're not going to treat division like a monolith, right? 3 divided by 1 is a lot different than 6,124 divided by 197. I can't do that one in my head, though I'm sure several of you who are listening to this can. The pre-assessment phase, right, finding this level is about finding the right anxiety to motivate growth. And there's going to be a different level for that in school, sports, self-growth, other spaces. Somebody might have a much different level of comfort in making friends than they do in dating. And we have to meet people at all their different levels and all their different places to help them move along. Now, as I'm sure what is going to come as a giant surprise to you guys is that I'm a theater kid. And one of the great pieces of theater is this ethos that the show must go on, right? Failure happens in every show. Sometimes it's big things, sometimes it's little things, but the show goes on. How do we make sure the show goes on? And it naturally puts us in this sort of creative problem-solving mode of we can't just like crank to a halt and say, well, that's the end of that. We're not going to do the second act of Hamilton. We are going to figure out how to make this work. And one great example of overcoming failure from the theater space is the Tragedy of Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. You may have heard of him. So in the Tragedy of Julius Caesar, there's this quote. Brutus says, peace, count the clock. And Cassius says, the clock hath stricken 3. Now, if I was doing this live, I would ask the room, what's wrong with this statement? And some people would talk about the grammar. Is the grammar weird? But no, it's iambic pentameter. And then finally somebody goes, wait a second. Clocks didn't exist in ancient Rome, right? They didn't. So this play puts a clock in 1,700 years before they were invented. So this isn't missed, Shakespeare didn't miss this by a couple of months. He missed this by the better part of 2 millennia. And if William Shakespeare can make a mistake in a play that is performed all over the world, is probably being formed right now, I'm pretty sure we can give ourselves a little bit more credit and a little bit more flexibility to make a mistake. The next thing we're going to talk about is committed action. So if we were in person, I would have you guys play a game, and this game is called Zoot. You may have heard of it, you may not have. The idea of Zoot is we're going to count in order. Bring 5 people up on stage, have them count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. And I'll tell them there's a pattern to this game you don't know. There's a set of numbers that you don't, instead of saying those numbers, you would say Zoot. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. You have to figure it out. So they get up there and they do it, and they can't figure it out. And they never do. And then, they get to the number 7. I yell Zoot. So now they've learned their first piece of information. Then they climb to 14, and I say Zoot again. And now they're starting to figure it out. And then they get to 17, and I say Zoot again. Now they get confused because the pattern is it's 7s, numbers that have 7 in them, and multiples of 7. So 7, 14, 17, 21, 27, 28, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a game you cannot play without failing. Failing is baked into the game, and it normalizes it. When you get up there on stage, you're taking a committed action to face your anxiety, face your fear of failure, because I'm not telling you what it is until you're already up there. And then this is a game that inevitably everybody ends up making a mistake. So this isn't just, oh, Johnny's the screw up. It's this team worked together and overcame its mistakes as a team. It's a really challenging thing, but it's a nice, simple game to play with your kids. And you don't have to do 7s, right? You could do 5s or 11s or whatever works for you. But the idea there is this is a committed action. You are literally saying the only way out of this is through. The next we have is self as context, not self as content. Failure is an event. It's not our personality. So when we personalize failure, we increase its impact on us. And our brains really like to center ourselves on what happens to us. So we have what the kids like to call main character energy, because our brains hate not knowing what's happening. Our brains hate it. So they would rather create an understandable but false narrative rather than have no narrative. So if you come home from work and your partner's upset, your brain's going to go, what did I do? Did I do something? I feel like I did something. What did I do? I'm really sorry. And maybe your partner just had a bad day at work, or maybe they just stubbed their toe on the kitchen counter, or. But when we center ourselves in the problem in that process, what ends up happening is that inevitably we make the people mad at us for asking, what did I do? What did I do? What did I do? And then they end up mad at us and we say, oh, good, I was right. But at what cost? There are always external factors that contribute to our failure. Many times the context has nothing to do with us. Context always matters. So here's some key failure contexts. The first is, are you a novice? Have you never done this before? Gifted people are notorious for being like, well, I'm pretty good at ice hockey and field hockey and golf, so I should be good at paddleball. Why? It's not the same thing. If you've never done it before, we need to grade you on a different scale. Ambiguity. Were the directions or tasks presented to you in a way that was clear or fair? Right? This gets into some of those expectation setting that we talked about before. You might be a world-class writer, but you also might be dysgraphic. So if I ask you to write a 10-page paper, that's probably not going to work out so well for you. But if you could type that same paper, you're going to be more successful. Very common context in the gifted population is perfectionism. When we let great become the enemy of done. Good can be the enemy of great. That's true. But great is often the enemy of done. At some point, we need to get the thing done so we can move on to our next task or tasks. The next is wrong place. Are you trying to succeed in the wrong environment for you? Right? Where can you adapt those environments or scale them? I run my own psychology practice, right? And I do a really great job of that. Part of the reason I work for myself, though, is because I don't work well in big group practices. I like to have that autonomy. I don't like following somebody else's rules. That's just how I know myself. So for some people, it'll be the opposite. I don't want to work alone. I want to work in a big group practice. You need to make sure that the context you're trying to succeed in is the right one. Next is systemic bias, right? That we live in a society where certain organizations have practices and beliefs embedded in them that hurt different groups. Not all of that is intentional, though some of it may be. But if you are someone who is of a minority status, and that could be a neuro minority, a racial minority, a sexual minority, whatever that might be, you may be in an environment that is not set up for you to succeed based on parts of yourself. And then last but not least, the gifted neurodiverse population, the standards we are being held to are often not our own. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a conversation where the kid is asking, can I move past addition and subtraction? Let me do multiplication or division or algebra. And the teacher ultimately gets mad at them, asking, gets mad, says, fine, here's some calculus. And the kid says, I can't do calculus. And the teacher says, see, if you're not being held to your own standards, if you don't have a say in that process, you're going to find that you fail more often than not. The next thing we have is fusion or diffusion from our thoughts. So here are some thinking styles that maintain failure. Black and white thinking. It's either perfect or it was bad. If you get a 98 on a test, I'm here to tell you as a mental health professional, I literally have a doctorate, that a 98 is a good grade on a test. You don't need to get 100 for it to be perfect. Next thing is all or nothing thinking. Part of this thing or event didn't go well, so I failed. I was talking to one of my kids. He's a very talented musician. He said, I was playing this, this piece of music in the seventh movement, and I was a little bit flat on one of those notes. So clearly I suck at the French horn. And I'm like, dude, I don't think anybody could tell. I certainly couldn't, because you're part of an orchestra. Would it be a little bit more visible or audible if you were playing by yourself? Maybe. But the fact of the matter is, most people couldn't tell that difference, right? That context matters a lot. Next is self-fulfilling prophecy. We talked about this a little bit before, but if you act like you knew you were going to fail, you're sooner or later going to behave in a way that proves you right, because our brains love to be right. The next thing we have is self-justification. So if you think that you failed, you're going to keep looking for information that proves you right. You will seek to make yourself miserable because your brain says, well, it's better to be miserable and right than uncomfortable and not know. The next thing we have is catastrophizing, assuming all failures are terrible, whereas most failures are quite small. I've stumbled over a few words so far, but none of the words I have gotten wrong have changed the meaning of what I'm trying to say. So, if you spell your name wrong on a test, it doesn't mean you're going to fail middle school. It just means you spelled your name wrong on a test. It happens. The way we fight back against this, the way we diffuse from these thoughts, is we try and model bottom-up thinking as opposed to top-down thinking. So I mentioned this before. If you get a 98 on a test, if you're doing top-down thinking, you assume perfect. Everything is perfect, and if it's less than perfect, it's bad. So a 98 is reframed as I got one problem wrong. I got 2 points off, right? I want to be at the top of the stairs, and I'm not. Bottom-up thinking is aspirational. It allows for the process of learning and growth, and it shows you how far you've come. So if you go, I got 98 on the test. Wow, that means I knew 98% of the material. Hot damn, that's much better than knowing 0% of the material, right? I always tell my kids, doing nothing is the default. If you don't do anything, well, nothing changes. But on the flip side of that, anything you do is value added. And that's really powerful. There's a great quote from Amanda Gorman here. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed something that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. So if you fuse to the thought that I failed, therefore I am broken, it's going to be really hard not to see yourself as broken. But if you allow yourself to see yourself as unfinished, I I got that note wrong in the musical because I haven't ever sung that song before, or I could have practiced harder, or I've never done iambic pentameter, or a million other pieces of context. You're going to defuse from that thought a little bit. And you may find that it's like, okay, a failure is a thing that happened to me. It isn't who I am. And that's a really powerful reframe. The next thing we have is the granddaddy of them all, psychological flexibility. Failure doesn't happen to us, it happens for us. Failure can increase our motivation. Trial and error is a piece of human learning, right? This is baked into us in our genetic code, and error or failure is based in that process. We learn by trying and failing. Watch a toddler sometimes. Toddlers fail all the time. They're trying to walk and they fall down. They're trying to put blocks together and they stumble. They're trying to eat pureed peas and it's like in the eye, over the head, it's just not, they're learning through doing. And the toddler anticipates and accepts failure. Yes, they might get upset by it and cry it, but you don't think they say, well, I can't eat, so I'm going to just give up on eating. They're going to try it again. Experience and failure strengthens us. Pressure turns coal into diamonds. And we do learn from our mistakes. My dad always said to me growing up, you either win or you learn. And I never got that as a kid. I was like, what does that even mean? Right. As an adult who is a professional and a psychologist and does all these things, I get it now. I have learned a lot more than I have won in my life. And every time I have failed, there's been a lesson for me to figure out to make me a little bit better next time. Even if that lesson is, there's nothing I could do, right? If you're driving a car and a tree suddenly falls down in front of you and you slam into the fallen down tree, nobody would prepare for that. That's not a realistic thing to prepare for. And thus, getting into that car accident doesn't make you a bad driver. Now, if you are changing the radio and playing Pokemon Go and yelling at your kids in the back seat when you slam into the car in front of you, there are some different lessons to that incident. Gifted people love to learn from their heroes, and there's lots of gifted people who are famous failures. Steven Spielberg was rejected from film school. Jerry Seinfeld had stage fright and got booed off stage the first time he did stand-up. Somebody told Elvis he had no charisma. I mean, that's wild to me. Soichiro Honda's factories were destroyed. Michael Jordan was cut from his basketball team. Winston Churchill lost 5 elections. I mean, there's a million examples. My favorite one, though, is Ruth Wakefield and chocolate chip cookies. Everybody loves chocolate chip cookies, right? And they were an accident. She was trying to mix the chocolate into the batter, and she didn't know that they would just sort of melt where they were. And yet, chocolate chip cookies are an international phenomenon, and everybody loves chocolate chip cookies. So her mistake literally changed the course of human history, not in a big way, but in a really delicious way. Probably my favorite quote on failure, and we mentioned him on the previous slide, is Winston Churchill. Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. We just got to keep going. There are only 3 ways to truly fail: never trying in the first place, giving up, or not improving. And the last one's probably the trickiest thing for gifted kids, because you can get so far on your natural abilities. You're smart, you're talented, you're clever, you're creative, all those wonderful things that come with being gifted. But at some point you level set, some point you hit where everybody else has grown to. And that's when you've got to sort of find that second gear and start learning, start growing intentionally. Because if you never improve, everybody else who's working hard is going to catch up with you and probably pass you at some point. So, what happened to Jennifer Lawrence? So, she walks up the stairs, she falls down, the entire world gasps, and she gets up there, and what she says in her acceptance speech is, "You guys are all clapping for me just because I fell." And the place lost its mind. And from a psychology perspective, from an ACT perspective, It's the best possible answer because she didn't pretend it didn't happen. She didn't get up there and she was like, everything is fine. Thank you for the award, and runs away. She also didn't go sprinting backstage, which nobody would have blamed her for, right? She stepped into the spotlight and she owned what happened to her. She accepted it. And then she used that acceptance to make a committed action. In this case, saying something about it and then giving the speech. So, from a psychological perspective, this is about as good as you can do. When you fail, you fail. We're not going to let it define it. We're going to let it refine us. There are lots of lessons that come from failure. Staying authentically humble, not false humble, right? Oh, I guess I'm just not that good. No, we're saying authentically humble because life is going to keep teaching us lessons. Thinking strategically about what we want to do. We cannot be successful at everything. What are the best returns on what we're working on? Embracing the change that comes with living, right? What changes are coming? We know change is a constant. So how do we embrace that when it shows up? Find people you can trust and learn to seek and accept feedback from them. If you want to take that next level, move in your own growth, you're probably going to need a coach, a mentor, a therapist, a boss, a leader, someone to help get you from A to B. There's only so far we can go alone. And you may find more failure if you are consistently going alone. So finding someone to help you get that feedback and grow is going to unlock that next step. And what are the resources you need or want to get that done? All right, so let me tell you guys about my most epic failure. Not my favorite story to tell, but it's got a happy ending. So in college, I went to Wake Forest University, go Deacs. And I was a editorial cartoonist for the school newspaper. In 2007, I was nominated along with many other of my colleagues from all over the country to go to the American Association of Editorial Cartoonists annual gala in Washington, D.C. And the way it works is there are 10 regions in the country. Each region nominates 4 students. And this year there was a mistake that was made and 5 invites went out to the Midwest. So 5 kids showed up. So there was supposed to be 40. There are 41 people. That's going to be important. And I'll tell you why. So part of this, right, is you sit on panels and you talk to people and you meet famous cartoonists. You also get your work adjudicated by a famous cartoonist, in my case, Annette Balstieri. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She's a big deal. And I'm sitting there in my suit and she's looking through my portfolio and, gifted kid, professional artist, used to being good at stuff. So I'm sitting there at some level sort of waiting for her to tell me how awesome I am. And so then she flips through, she looks up, she goes, "You're not that good at this." I'm sorry, what? She was like, how did you get nominated for this? And it's that moment where it's like, oh gosh, this isn't an elaborate joke. Like, you actually mean this. And she proceeded to rip my cartoons apart as unoriginal, uninspired. She didn't agree with my politics. She didn't like my drawing style. I mean, I was mortified. And I sat there and I took my lumps. And then when she dismissed me, I grabbed my portfolio and I ran in the bathroom for a while and cried. It was not very pleasant. And I was supposed to sit on a panel that afternoon, and I just went to the train station, got an early train, and went back to New Jersey. And I was really upset, you know. And I got home and I talked to my parents. I said, "Listen, there's a lesson in this. We don't know what it is yet. The key word there is yet. Like, they weren't trying to jam the lesson down my throat. We didn't know what it was. But at some point, a meaningful lesson would come from this." So I spent a couple of days licking my wounds, and then finally on day 3, I sat down and my mom said, "Okay, I've got something in here that I think is going to help you out." So she said, and the very last thing that Annette wrote in her feedback was, "He's not a very good political cartoonist, but he would make a good comic book artist." And from there, I launched my webcomic, My Roommate's a Superhero, and I ran that for 2 years in the late aughts. And directly from there comes my graphic novel that comes out later this year. Now, I'm not saying that without this moment, I wouldn't have gotten these things done. I don't know. But I do know that this catastrophe moment, getting absolutely shredded by somebody I looked up to, showed me that I actually that you could recover from failures like that. And I mean, you remember how I mentioned there were 41 kids there, they were supposed to be 40? I finished 41st in the adjudication. I was literally worst of the worst of the worst. And yet, when my book comes out this year, I'm gonna mail a copy to Annette Balsieri with a thank you because I learned from that failure. I learned how to be more intentional with my art. I learned how to take myself more seriously and prepare for a moment rather than just short of showing up and hoping my talent would take me the rest of the way. You know, I and it's not even something I can say now that I wish didn't happen because I don't know. But I can tell you now, I'm glad it did. So here's how you track me down if you have more conversations about this. This is a talk that works really well for schools and gifted learners and companies and athletic organizations. Failure happens to all of us. If we can change how we deal with it, we're going to end up feeling and doing a lot better. Like the quote says, if I fail more than you do, I win. So I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski. Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed recording this presentation. It's one of my favorite ones to give. Here's how to track me down if you have any follow-up questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.